I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast by RANE. After years of stagnation, Syria's civil war suddenly reignited in November 2024 to truly spectacular geopolitical change. In less than a few weeks, the Syrian government, which had weathered 13 years of civil war, collapsed in a remarkably fast and orderly transition. Now, shorn of the Assad family for the first time in 50 years, Syria is charting new, uncertain courses, many of which are fraught with the risk of another round of fighting. Here to provide his insights on the subject is RANE's Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst, Ryan Bohl. Hi, Ryan. Great to speak with you.
Hi, Emma. Nice to talk to you.
Can you start by explaining why Assad collapsed as quickly as he did?
Yeah, and let me caveat that we don't have this whole story just yet. There is still some insider baseball that I think we need to connect the dots. But broadly speaking, in late November 2024, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, which is a rebel group, an al-Qaeda descendant, but now is broken off from al-Qaeda and is in an independent jihadist outfit, began an offensive around Idlib province in northwestern Syria, where it had been sitting and stationed since basically early 2020, where during the last real big major confrontation between the rebels and the government forces in this long-running civil war. And they started this offensive, and it didn't look like there was necessarily anything out of the ordinary other than the fact that it was a major offensive in what was otherwise a frozen and stagnant civil war. And then, to the surprise of everyone, and I think that to the surprise of the Assad government and its own soldiers, as far as we can see so far, they began to advance past front lines that had been entrenched and fortified for many years, and then they marched into Aleppo and shocked everyone in a city that the Syrian government had fought tooth and nail to control for 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, was able to take it in a handful of days. And then from there, the dominoes just fell apart. Once Aleppo fell, another major city along the crucial M5 highway, Hama to the south, that then became the next place where the Assad government was supposed to hold the line. They failed to. HTS marched into that. Once Hama fell, it became clear that the regime was falling apart, that it was dissolving in front of us. And Assad made threats that he was going to make a speech to try to rally the troops, and there was a widespread expectation that the Russians and the Iranians would rush forces in to save Assad, as they have in the past, at the last minute. But things moved so quickly that the outsiders, the Iranians and the Russians, couldn't get forces there in time. Meanwhile, in every position that the Assad government's troops tried to set up to hold a frontier against the advancing rebels, the troops just melted away and would withdraw and continued to do so until eventually rebels took control of southern Syria. U.S.-backed rebels out in the Syrian desert at a base called Tanf began their advance, and there was a race towards Damascus, and the Assad government just kept unraveling and unraveling until we saw rebels in Assad's palace, and Assad then popped up in Moscow a few days later, having never made his nationwide speech, having never made threats to burn down Damascus rather than cede power as he had in the past. The government collapsed with a whimper, and given the catastrophic impact of the civil war, this was what was so surprising, is that it turned out that at the end of the day, when there was a relatively, it was a notable military push by HTS in the context of the civil war, but it was only around 10,000 fighters or so, well outnumbered by what was on paper the Syrian army, which is probably 80,000 to 100,000 troops, at least on paper. There should have been at least a few capable divisions able to check them, and they simply didn't. And it looks like the thing that we don't know is, was this internal betrayal, but was there Turkish intelligence, or was there HTS having infiltrated the Syrian government and the Syrian army and convinced them to essentially stand aside for this offensive? Or was it just chaos caused by years of war, of purges, of sanctions, of poverty that meant that the Syrian army was no longer able to function as an organizational force? And I don't know if we have the full story on that yet. It's maybe a bit of both in the final estimation of this history. But that is essentially what happened.
I know you mentioned that we're still tracking this and there's a lot more to come before we have answers, but can you tell me a bit about what trends you had been tracking leading up to the collapse that maybe could have pointed to the turmoil?
So in retrospect, we had seen that the political model of Syria really wasn't sustainable. You can't stay in economic isolation with such a devastated economy after the civil war and expect to retain power. And I always thought that an internal coup was the most likely way that Assad might go. Instead, it was this almost, breeze of an offensive by HTS that ended up unraveling the system. And we knew for years that the Assad government was failing to pay salaries for civil servants and for Syrian soldiers. We knew that food shortages were normal. Medicine was in short supply. Real estate was impossible to rebuild. Basically, Syria was only able to provide a very basic standard of living for a handful of regime insiders, and more or less everybody, including large swaths of the Syrian army and security services, were left to squabble over whatever they could smuggle in through the black market. It was a very dire economic situation, and it's hard to imagine people putting up with that for an extended period of time. What was so surprising here is that, again, it came from the outside. It came from the rebellion itself, rather than from a regime insider saying, we need to get rid of Assad. But, at the end of the day, if as Assad failed to break out of isolation, that was, at the end of the day, the fatal recipe for his downfall.
So if we're going to transition to what is currently happening, can you comment on what the political transition has looked like so far?
Yes, and it's messy. In shorthand, it's messy politically. From a security standpoint, there has been some violence. There's been some fighting between various rebel factions and Turkish-backed factions versus Kurdish-dominated factions. But there hasn't been a resumption of the full-scale civil war that would result in massive displacement or new destruction. Right now, the de facto leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, the head of HTS, is running the country on almost, a wing and a prayer. He doesn't hold a formal position of power right now. There is a transitional prime minister. Many of the Assad-era ministries are still nominally running and are still staffed by the same people as the Assad government before it fell. So there's still the skeleton of the old regime running things, and then there are the rebel factions trying to find the best way to negotiate a transition away from that structure in a way that doesn't result in another civil war, which they're all very cognizant could very much happen based on both regional history and, of course, Syrian history and the stakes of what's going on in Syria itself. Many of these factions have ideological and political ambitions. They want to see a certain type of Syria that behaves a certain way within the region. They have very hardened opinions about that, but they have just gone through a brutal civil war for 14 years. They are aware that Syria could be have another foreign intervention, very likely by Turkey if things don't go Turkey's way, but also by the United States and Israel, who also have their own vested interests in the country. And so none of them want to make the move first to destabilize the transition, but we haven't yet seen signs that the rebel factions are prepared to carry out the deep compromises that are going to be necessary in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religion state like, or nation state like Syria. So we are waiting right now for this national dialogue conference where HTS is meant to disband and become a provisional government leader, like a political party of some kind. We'll see what format that takes. From the National Dialogue Conference, we are then looking for the timeline by which they will try to hold elections or at least some sort of a conference to write a new Syrian constitution. That could take some time. And then finally, in theory, new elections entirely for a full new Syrian government. But Ahmed al-Sharaa has said it could take up to 4 years for new elections, 3 years for a constitution. That somewhat suggests that he prefers not only a slow pace towards the transition, but that he might not all be that interested at all in things like constitutions or democracy or elections or anything like that, and that he would prefer to consolidate power through more traditional regional statecraft of cutting deals with individual factions and crafting his own government out of personalities.
What kind of political model do you think Syria will evolve towards in the medium to long term?
Yeah, and And of course, we need to wait to see what the National Dialogue Conference and all these other steps look like. But based on what we're seeing right now, it would probably be something like an Islamist-controlled authoritarian state, one that is focused pretty extensively on Syria and Syrian interests, that will be something of a proxy political theater between various powers like Turkey and Israel and the US and Iran and Saudi Arabia, but which, because of its history with its civil war, is disinterested in taking that political rivalry that these foreigners are going to fuel and returning to battle. Now, of course, there is a possibility that there is factionalism that results in a split in Syria, particularly between the Kurds and the Arab and Alawite and Druze and other factions. That's very much something that could happen. But given the amount of damage caused by the civil war, the appetite for more violence is relatively limited. And so, if I'm going to take a stab at what things could look like over the next, say, 2 to 5 years, it's an authoritarian Islamist state that might have the trappings of democracy. It might have some elections. It might have a constitution. But at the end of the day, it's still a centralized authoritarian state. And most of the politics play out through personalities rather than through constitutional norms or democratic norms. It ends up looking a lot like, say, Egypt, or it might look like Tunisia, and to a certain extent, maybe even Lebanon, and less so like even a place like its neighbor Iraq, where there are elections and there are new governments that come and go through the democratic process.
Well, thanks, Ryan. It's great to hear your thoughts as always.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for having me.
For more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.